Okay, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ryan Tappy and I work with the ALS Association in our Mid-Atlantic territory. Thank you for joining us for the first day of ALS Clinical Research Week. There are a few things we want you to know before we begin. There will be time at the end of this webinar for questions. You should see on your screens an option for Q&A. You can type questions you have there at any time and we will review them at the end of the webinar to provide answers. You can also submit your questions in our chat box feature. We do have a very short survey we are asking that everyone complete after the webinar. This survey will appear in your browser once the webinar ends. These surveys help us to know your thoughts on this webinar so that we can improve in the future. ALS Clinical Research Week will feature a webinar every day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Each webinar will focus on an aspect of ALS research. In today's webinar, we will be learning about the MyTomorrows program, which can help connecting to clinical trials. Joining us today to present will be Melody Schaefer and Brittany Garcia Trujillo, who are both from the ALS Association. Melody Schaefer joined the ALS Association about a year and a half ago as the Senior Director of Mission Programs. In her role, she directs the development and execution of national programs that seek to make ALS a livable disease by 2030. This work includes reducing the time to diagnosis, improving access to resources like genetic counseling, testing, and clinical trials. Additionally, she leads the direction of the twice-annual ALS Roundtable program, which is the ALS Association's forum for bringing together people with ALS, caregivers, healthcare providers, researchers, and policymakers to collaborate on advancing care and treatments. She holds a PhD in public health from St. Louis University and a Master of Public Health from Washington University in St. Louis. Presenting along with Melody will be Brittany Garcia Trujillo. Brittany joined the fight against ALS in 2014 after losing her grandfather to ALS. In over 9 years at the ALS Association, Brittany has taken on many roles, including working directly with families and corporations to raise critical funds for the mission, and working to improve national operations as the organization unified its efforts. Today, she serves as the Associate Director of Mission Programs. Brittany focuses on reducing the time it takes to get a diagnosis, making clinical trials more accessible, and expanding opportunities for genetic counseling and testing. She also manages the Roundtable program. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Melody and Brittany, and I will return for the Q&A.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here and talking about one of my favorite topics, which is clinical trials. And to kick off this week, I'm so excited for Brittany and myself to really dive into not just what clinical trials are, but really one of the partnerships that we launched about a year ago, and to talk through the ways that perhaps there's navigating clinical trials and ways that we can find clinical trials that are tailored to your needs, or perhaps more education and information. And we will have quite a bit of time at the end for questions. So do put those in through chat. And I think Ryan's going to talk about how to submit those. So we love questions. Usually I say ask questions throughout and I'll pause and make it a little more conversational, but I'm keeping an eye on that participant list and to keep it a little more organized and to listen to Ryan's recommendation. We will wait till until the end, but as you think of them, you can put those through. You don't have to wait till the very end to submit your questions. So my name is Melody Schaefer. I joined the ALS Association about a year and a half ago. I came from the oncology space where I really was thinking about diagnosis, access to treatment, access to screening and preventative services, and really kind of thinking about that in the ALS space has been a really incredible opportunity for me. And I've been meeting some really incredible folks, not just my colleagues, but folks all across the ALS community, from individuals living with ALS, caregivers, allied health professionals, which I always like to shout out because I think they are so undervalued in many spaces, not just ALS, but across all healthcare, as well as our wonderful doctors, clinic directors, and of course, those of us that are invested in clinical trials, from the individuals doing clinical trials to folks helping you enroll. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. When we talk about clinical trials, you might hear people talk about them as clinical research, or someone might say, are you interested in joining research for ALS? Really, what we're talking about is typically the drug development process. So ultimately, when we talk about clinical trials or clinical research or research, often the process is to determine if there is a way we can create or evaluate some sort of treatment that can either address symptoms, address a disease prognosis, or ultimately change a diagnosis journey or change care after a diagnosis. What's really important to know in the United States, sorry, Brittany, if you'll go back real quickly, if in the United States, we do have the FDA, so that's the Federal Drug Administration, and every step of the way in our pipeline, FDA is heavily involved. So when we are talking about clinical research and clinical trials that we endorse as the ALS Association, these are science and research that do have oversight. And so every piece of these clinical trial pathway really does have oversight. They have individuals who their job is to make sure that these are safe, that these are the right science, and that this is good science. So there might be times when there are science happening outside the walls of what's regulated through the FDA, but know that everything that we are endorsing and talking through today does fit into that regulation process from the FDA. So there are kind of this pipeline across the continuum of clinical trials, and it can get a little confusing. So I'll just do kind of a high level of the stages, the phases, and why each of these are critical in ultimately coming to a drug approval. So all the way at the very beginning, typically inside of labs, we are talking about the biology at a molecular level. So really diving into the science, the bench science, how something might work in a test tube, something might work in a mouse model or a fly model. So this really early science where an academic researcher or a pharma researcher or a biotech is really putting their brains to great length to come up with a hypothesis to test it in this really controlled lab setting. So this is done before we ever start talking to individuals about enrolling in a clinical trial. So that all kind of happens before we get to a phase 1, which is called kind of this first in human studies. And typically in phase 1, what the question that we're asking is it safe? So this is going to be really small trial numbers, maybe 20, very small, really looking at what happens to individuals in the safety realm. Once that is complete, we move into phase 2, really starting to look at how is this drug or this treatment administered? Is it something that is a tablet or taken orally? Is it something that requires an IV? What does the dosing look like? Is it every day? Is it once a month? Starting to figure out kind of this efficiency piece, or is it effective, starts to be the question. And that last phase 3, you're going to start to see hundreds of individuals really looking at how is it effective? Is there a treatment advantage from the phase 3 data? Not only have we cleared that is safe, it is not doing anything negative, there's no adverse harm that is kind of consequential. We also can say, given groups of people that did not receive the treatment or that placebo group, we can see that the treatment is actually working. And it's really important that across this entire kind of phase for drug development, each step does have to be completed. We cannot get to a phase 3 without a phase 2 or a phase 1 or all of this pre-science that happens before we even move into the first in humans. So after all of those phases are completed, know that each step there is, again, data is reviewed. There are individuals who are looking at that to ensure that before something is moved on, we are doing, we or the science community is doing a due diligence to ensure that the right science is moving forward. That's what happens before we get to that drug development. So clinical trials are really critical to drug development. It is the process in which this country and most countries follow the path to ensure that drugs are safe and effective. Next slide, please. It is really important for an individual to decide if participating in a clinical trial is something they're interested in. Again, we cannot have drug development without clinical trials, and we can't have clinical trials without participation. But it's also a very individual decision. And when we talked to people, Brittany and I recently got a bunch of feedback on kind of why folks felt called for a clinical trial. And it ranged everything from individuals feeling that it's additional treatment opportunities, it's different care than perhaps they were receiving as their standard care because of the exploratory science. There are also others that really believe in the science process and wanted to be part of something that might lead to future treatment options or future changes in what's offered for in the drug world. And it doesn't necessarily matter why someone decides to join a clinical trial, but what is important is that there are people that are willing to join that clinical trial process. Where we do see some confusion is on who can join a clinical trial. Every trial will have different inclusion and exclusion criteria. What I mean by that is there are a lot of different trials all looking at different mechanisms, different placebos or different treatment versus placebo, different dosing, and they're all going to have their own criteria. So unfortunately, what I cannot do today is list, if you have kind of check this list or don't check this list, you will automatically qualify for a clinical trial, because it really does come down to each individual trial has their own list, which makes the process a little hard, which is actually kind of why we joined this partnership with MyTomorrows, which I'm getting to very soon. But some of the standard ones might be age, time since diagnosis, lung function. If there is a genetic component to the clinical trial, or if they are looking at a very specific gene mutation, typically for someone to qualify in that trial, they would need to have a genetic test and would need to have that genetic mutation. So those are some of the things that are kind of the bigger picture for standard criteria. But again, it really does come down to that individual trial. The big question we always get from folks that are interested in clinical trials is how to find a trial. And if I find a trial, how do I know if I qualify for it? There are a lot of different resources, and I have them listed here. And I believe Ryan is actually going to drop a chat that's going to help folks get to these hyperlinks. So know that you're going to get these resources, because each of those do represent a different resource. And many of these are trial navigation services. So NEALS, or the Northeast ALS Consortium, they do have some resources for finding trials, same as clinicaltrials.gov. That is, of course, kind of the main government website for clinical trials here in the US. There is also the ALS TDI, or Therapy Development Institution, has a trial navigator resource. IMALS has resources. But the last one that I really want to focus on is this last one down here, where it says MyTomorrows. Are there ALS clinical trials available for you? Next slide, please. And so we started with MyTomorrows after having done a bit of work before we got to MyTomorrows. So why are we even talking to you about MyTomorrows today? A few years ago, we actually started another program where we worked one-on-one with a biotech company or a pharma company, where we were trying to really promote one trial specifically. And it was really difficult. So where we found that it was really hard for those of us to put a lot of resources to just filling one trial, knowing there are many trials. So we backed up and we said, we need to partner with a company that has the resources and has the staff that is able to look at all of the trials. They're able to talk to somebody about trials, not just where you live, but where you would feel comfortable going to, or where you would feel comfortable finding a clinical trial. So all that to say is, when we started working with MyTomorrows, they are a international tech company, but their actual mission and their business plan is to help individuals find clinical trials. So they don't just work with ALS, they work in many different disease spaces. But where they are a little bit different from this other list of navigators, where you might have to go on and search and click your own criteria, is they have navigators that work one-on-one with individuals living with ALS. And what they can do is work with you directly to find out your individual inclusion or exclusion criteria compared to different trials, and actually be experts in those trials and walk you through to find, hopefully, a trial that fits for you. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brittany, to walk through what does the actual platform of MyTomorrows, what would it look like if you actually participated or wanted to join in with MyTomorrows, and then I'll be back in a little bit to take questions and tell you where we're going next.
Awesome. Thanks, Melody. Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Garcia Trujillo. I'm excited to share just a few things because I see coming in the chat. Kuldip Dave, Dr. Kuldip Dave, he is answering some of your questions in the chat. He's our SVP of research. So just know that's who this gentleman is. And we'll mind the internet connectivity. So if I speak a little bit slower, It's just to make sure that everyone can hear a little bit about what we're presenting today. So to talk about a little bit about how we got involved with MyTomorrows and the process itself. With MyTomorrows, as Melody mentioned, we really wanted to make sure we're putting at the center our families living with ALS. So what you see here on this slide is how to kind of go through that process with MyTomorrows. First of all, please know these services are free. So I did see in the chat someone talk about that they have bulbar onset. And if there are any clinical trials that specifically address that, we encourage you to scan the QR code. Ryan, who's our host, is going to be dropping a link that will direct you to the form. But with MyTomorrows, what they do is that they're going to walk you through the entire process. So we like to call it kind of like a 4-step process. The first one is you scan this QR code or you select on the link that Ryan just put in the chat to fill out a form, basically saying, I want to speak to someone at MyTomorrows, someone with their patient navigators, that's what they call them, and they have a medical background, and they're able to connect with you in whatever language that you prefer. Once you fill that out, you select your date, time, and preference. Don't worry, they'll send you email reminders because we know life is busy. But once you speak with them, essentially they're going to walk you through the next steps, which may sometimes have you complete an active profile on their website, just in case you need to upload any medical documentation to, again, validate some of the conversations you had. And as you get along through the process, you'll actually, if there's any clinical trials that actually pertain to some of your interests and eligibility, again, to some of that criteria that Melanie mentioned, you'll get a personalized list that is specifically tailored to your needs. And so what we encourage here at the organization is that you take that list and talk about it with your ALS clinic team, your physician, to see what's really going to work best for you. But ultimately, like Melody shared, it's a personal decision. This is ultimately up to you to decide if you really want to pursue going down this path and if it works for you. So if that does, then you just let your patient navigator know at MyTomorrows, hey, I've talked about it with my doctor, and I actually want to pursue this trial. Can you please connect me with that trial location? And they'll be more than happy to do that. So again, free service. They do all the legwork for you. You just have to have a 20-30-minute conversation with them to kind of let them know kind of where you are in your ALS journey and see kind of what best fits for you. Here's a quick little demo to kind of walk you through what that looks like visually. So I'm going to narrate that. So give me 1 second. So with the patient navigator, like I said, free service in the language that works best for you. So hopefully this is running on your end, but essentially with the link that Ryan sent over to you, you'll be directed to our co-branded website. There you'll find information about what clinical trials are and then how to explore options for you. You'll fill out first, last name, some information, and then hit submit. It asks you for some consent about what information you're willing to share, not just with MyTomorrows, but also with us as the ALS Association. You select the date, time, and again, the language that you prefer. They'll give you a little buzz. You'll have a conversation with them, and then they'll send you an email saying, hey, please activate your account so that if we need you, the person living with ALS, to upload any medical documentation, then you can do that in a secure way versus email and what have you. You activate your account, and once that happens, you're actually able to communicate with the patient navigator back and forth or upload any documents and as well download your personalized list of clinical trials that may be available to you. So this is kind of what that account looks like. Now, when we first initiated this program, we had a lot of people enthusiastic about this, and rightfully so. It's very interesting to participate in clinical trials, especially if this is something that appeals to you. We actually had over 200 people say that they're interested in it. But as you see here, the numbers kind of start reducing after different steps. And that's either because someone decided, you know what, this doesn't feel right, time for me, or life is just busy. I can't do this right now. But a lot of people actually did decide to pursue this. They had their call with their patient navigator, about 50 of them did. And then after that, almost 70% of people, or about 70 people living with ALS received a personalized trial list that then they spoke with their physician to kind of see what that looks like, whether or not to pursue things. We share all this because ultimately, as we are looking at how to make your life easier, if clinical trials is something that you're interested, we're here to help. After we kind of initiated this program, we asked families like, hey, what worked for you? What did you like? And how can we improve this, not just for you, but for others as well? And what we found is that the majority of people actually heard about clinical trials for the first time through this program, which tells us that we play a really crucial role to making sure that we're addressing the questions that you may have about anything from what clinical trials are to how does this process work and how can it help me? A lot of people said that they want to speak with their physician and ALS clinic team to decide this, which rightfully so. Like that's part of your team who's going to help you through this journey. And when we looked at ways that we can help people decide about whether or not to pursue clinical trials, we really try to focus on what's going to make things easier for you. And so when we looked at this specific partnership, we wanted to make sure we took the lift off of a lot of the legwork that people may be doing to do their own research, which rightfully so. Do the research that you want, but in case life is just busy or it's just overwhelming, MyTomorrows can be a good solution for you. We also heard there's a lot of concerns about whether or not ultimately deciding to pursue a clinical trial or not, personal beliefs to finances and everything in between. So one of the links that Ryan shared early on is talking about what are clinical trials and some of those frequently asked questions that you may have as to like, what happened, what can I expect, or how do I read this, or what happens like through the actual process of enrollment and what can I expect? So please check that out when you have a chance. And of course, we're going to answer your questions here shortly. One of the things we also heard a lot from the community is, you know what, sometimes a phone call is not the appropriate way to connect with me. And we understand that. So what we're doing and MyTomorrows is working on is they're looking at other ways to do the intake form with the patient navigator besides just a phone call in case that's not an option or something that isn't right for you. So just know that's in the works. And ultimately, we want to be here to help provide the resources so that you can make the decision that works best for you. So I'll kind of turn it over to Melody here next to talk about what we want to do to help you out as you think about if clinical trials is something that you want to pursue. Melody?
Thanks, Brittany. And I am really enjoying this chat. There's so many questions coming through. So I know Coldup and I were just trying to answer as many as possible. So no, there's a few more answers coming your way. But ultimately, where our commitment is to find ways to provide resources for folks living with ALS and their caregivers to find what's best for them, be it a clinical trial now or maybe later. This might just be an education opportunity for you. This might be the first time somebody is talking to you about clinical trials or hearing about what they really are or understanding the phases. And that's great too. Our goal and our hope is that clinical trials become accessible, both from what they are, how they're administered, how the oversight process runs, all the way to who can apply or who is eligible, who can enroll, and then, of course, clearing up as many steps as possible from where are the trials housed to eligibility to enrollment. So our continued commitment, regardless of the other resources in the ALS community, what the ALS Association will continue to do is really continue to talk about what clinical trials are. We have this partnership. We are committed to talking about it as many places as we can. We're sending out more emails, putting it in our web or either our research newsletters or the different newsletters to different folks. We're here at Clinical Trials Week. So thank you, Ryan, for thinking of us. We're also really thinking about how our communication looks. How are we providing information on clinical trials? Back to the same point of it's an individual decision, but we want you to have as much resource and much education to make the most informed clinical decision and also share decision making with your provider to talk through what perhaps you've found through additional resources and then what they believe is also best in your care and what's going to make the most sense. Science and clinical trials and government websites can be really difficult to navigate. And if you have ever logged on to clinicaltrials.gov, know that it can be a little difficult to find what you're looking for. And so we are always trying to come up with ways, not just through partnerships that are diluting those websites into a more palatable form, but in these opportunities for continued education and raising up what we're doing to advocate for clinical trials. And then we're also, engaging with physicians. And throughout this week, I know that there's a great lineup of these different webinars, from hearing from some of the folks doing the research or some of the late breaking science. I know Hold Up will be wrapping these presentations up at the end of the week with some more insights from where the science stands. And so we're really trying to make sure that all sorts of information is available and accessible to you all. So without that, I know that there have been so many questions in the chat. We've taken about half of the time, but because of the chat engagement, I'd love to pause, open it up to Q&A if there's anything that we can if we can do now. And Coldip, since you are on, I'm going to give you a fair warning that if any of these are outside of the scope of my science, I am not a pharmacologist or a neuroscientist. The floor will be yours should any of those questions come your way. So Ryan, I'll let you kind of facilitate the Q&A and we'll respond as necessary.
Wonderful. And yeah, I'm glad Kodip could join us, and I saw he was answering a lot of your questions that came across the chat, so that's great. Just some other questions that popped up. My one is my research coordinator at KU Med in Kansas City is very aware of my willingness and desire to participate in clinical drug trials. Should I also pursue trials through MyTomorrow?
I think it's a great question. And it also shows that there are a lot of resources and a lot of different trial advocates. And while I don't know your trial liaison at KU, so I don't want to speak on their behalf, but they might just know about trials at KU. What MyTomorrows does is it offers all trials. So if they're talking to you about every trial in the US, then they have the same information probably that MyTomorrows does. But where MyTomorrows might offer a different resource is to be able to pull up trials, say in San Francisco or in New York City, and say, these are recruiting, you might be eligible. And so if the individual you're plugged into at KU is doing that, then perhaps, you're good. But if not, and they're only talking about KU or Kansas City Metro or even Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska opportunities, then MyTomorrows might provide a different resources.
Great. Another one, does the MyTomorrows program go as far as helping you to get enrolled in the trials that you're matched with?
They're working on that. So what they are doing is there is a physician liaison. What we have found is not all physicians are familiar with MyTomorrows. So when an individual gets their tailored list of clinical trials, the current step and encouragement is that shared decision-making process with your physician. MyTomorrows can help facilitate the enrollment, but they are not automatically enrolling. And I'll also kind of pause and reflect that to some degree, we're kind of glad they're not automatically enrolling, because we still want you to be the decision maker of your clinical trials and to have that shared decision making with your physician, and not having a third party automatically enrolling somebody in a clinical trial. So that does not happen, and a variety of reasons, but they do advocate with those site principal investigators or the people running the trial. They are sending notices about eligible individuals. Of course, we do have to talk to the site coordinator. It does come down to that individual at the site. So that it's a little bit of yes and a little bit of no.
Great. In this one, I'm going to combine two questions here because I think they're somewhat related. I'm not sure if you have the answer to this, but one question is asking about how MyTomorrows is funded, and whether if you know if it's an NGO, a corporation, an academic institute.
Certainly. So I don't work for MyTomorrows, so I'll do my best here. They have funding through biotech pharma. So the sponsors of these trials, because they become a navigation source. So ultimately what they're doing is getting more people to trial, kind of that faster trial piece. And so they do have funding from pharma and as well as other investors. There is no charge to the individual. There is no charge for nonprofits to advocate. So they have funding from different investor groups. I believe that they are a private tech company. I can't speak to kind of all of their business models behind, but there is not a cost associated to those living with ALS or to the nonprofits that are advocating for those individuals.
Wonderful. Another question, if you go into a clinical trial, do you have to move into a closed setting like a hospital, clinic, etc.?
Coldup, do you want to talk through any of the different kind of trial features and what some folks might expect in different settings?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. A closed setting like a hospital or clinic as opposed to an open setting. I mean, I think most trials are work with trial sites, and these sites are generally clinics that can recruit people living with ALS to be in the trials. So, you know, a lot of these clinics could be either a part of a hospital, and so there may be a day when there's an ALS clinic, or it's a standalone ALS clinic that, you know, that the trial is part of. So I'm thinking that's what the question was when, but I hope I answered it.
Thank you. I'm not seeing. Let me see. Yeah, I see a question about whether if you don't have a phone to scan the QR code. I did post in there a link to the MyTomorrows website where you can complete the form, so you can utilize that as well. Here's a question. Oops, it just went away on me. Hold on. Oh, it might have been deleted, so I'm not sure. Oh, yes, Brittany, it looks like was on that. Do contents of individual trial postings on MyTomorrows go through ethics approval before being posted?
Yes. So the trials that you'll see on MyTomorrows are still the same trials that are on clinicaltrials.gov. And I did know that they're an international company. So we're talking about the US today, but there are people that use MyTomorrows in different spaces. They rely on the same regulatory pathways for those individual countries. So anything that is improved outside of the country, that's happening outside of the country, MyTomorrows is still held to the standards of whatever approval process that country follows. There is no pay, call up MyTomorrows, I'm going to pay you amount of money and kind of bypass all of those regulatory or ethics standards. They have just made what is already approved an easier to navigate website, and then also adding the navigation. So there's no like secret or different clinical trials that are only going to be on MyTomorrows. They are still following all of the regulations that clinical trials that we would endorse and talk about are subject to.
Great. And then here's a specific question. I was told I do not have a certain gene to take a pill that is available. How does someone like me get into a clinical trial? Um, I'm a little confused by that question, but I don't know if you guys are able to answer that at all. It is in the Q&A if you need to reference it. And while you guys are looking at that, I have a few questions that have popped over as well. Would you consider MyTomorrows to be a more patient-friendly version of clinicaltrials.gov?
I do, yes.
Okay.
I can take the other question about not having a certain gene. So I think that was from Francis. I think what Francis is talking about is that FDA approved a therapy 2 years ago called tofersen or Qalsody. And this is for a very small portion of people living with ALS. It's people who have a particular gene mutation called SOD1 or SOD1 mutation. If you have SOD1 mutation gene, then you qualify for tofersen or Qalsody. And so, Francis, anybody that can be part of, whether you have a particular gene, then there might be trials that are looking for people that have that particular gene. There's actually a couple of studies ongoing right now that are only recruiting people that have certain gene mutations. If you don't have gene mutations and your ALS is non-genetic ALS, then most trials that are on MyTomorrows are looking for people that have, sporadic ALS or non-genetic ALS.
Okay. And I actually I posted a link to a article on that new drug that you mentioned that Brittany and Melody shared with me earlier. So that is in the chat as well if you guys are interested in more information on that. A few more questions are coming through. Does MyTomorrows have access to all trials and research studies, or do I need to work with multiple navigators?
No, we have 2 to 3 navigators that are dedicated and trained in the ALS space. They might work on different disease spaces, but they're going to be familiar with the ALS community as well as the trials that are available that are currently enrolling, as well as some that are, once they get posted to clinical trials, if they're not yet enrolling, those are also posted too. And so one navigator at MyTomorrows is going to be able to look at kind of your inclusion or exclusion criteria against all ALS trials. And there, you don't need to work with multiple. They would be able to do that once. And typically we've heard that most folks talk to that navigator or engage with that navigator anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. So no, they really are diving into those trials with you. This is not a 5-minute screening call where they're going to take down your information and then kind of hang up on you. They're pretty in depth. So that individual that is navigating that process with you will have all information available at that time.
Great.
Melody, I just want to add to that, kind of going back to a slide that we had here. For a person living with ALS, when they went through the process with MyTomorrows, here's, recommendation or their experience. Like, they had a really great experience with MyTomorrows because it takes away a lot of the legwork that they may be doing from working with different people just to find what works best for them. Again, we're not affiliated with MyTomorrows. We're just in partnership with them, and ultimately it's your decision. But this person had really great things to say about them because through the entire process, that patient navigator that you speak with stays with you throughout the entire process until you get your personalized trials list, so that you talk to your doctor, you decide what you want to move forward with, and then you go back to the same patient navigator to say yes or no. Here's what I want to do next. So I just wanted to highlight that again for individuals that are curious about MyTomorrows and how that kind of they stand apart from other avenues as well.
Great. Thank you for that additional information. Another question popped through. Once you participate in a trial, who has access to the data contained in the trial?
Hold up, do you want to talk about either the academic centers or the biotechs or the drug sponsors from the actual data on clinical trials, and maybe even a little touch on the approval with the FDA and how that data is used?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ryan. Could you repeat the question again?
Absolutely. Once you participate in a trial, who has access to the data contained in the trial?
So thank you, Ryan. So it is only the drug sponsor that has access to that data. And this is really important because we don't want that data to get out in the public. A lot of the trials are blinded trials, so you may not know whether you're getting placebo or the drug. Sometimes the clinic doesn't know whether you're getting the placebo or the drug. And so data integrity is really important in a clinical trial. If you are in a clinical trial, you should not typically be forecasting or going on social media and talking about how you're feeling, or you're feeling better or not feeling better. That could potentially unblind the trial or cause other people with ALS who might be in the trial to, sway in one direction or the other. So data integrity, data confidentiality is really important. The drug sponsors will make sure that that happens. I think the question, Ryan, is what happens after the trial ends? And this is where we, the ALS Association, has partnered with Mass General Hospital. It's a platform called PROACT. And PROACT is a place where all of the de-identified data, once the trial is done, can be put in. So nothing can be traced back to you, but it's all de-identified data. And this type of data is really important because if we can collect this de-identified data and make it available worldwide, then people can learn from these trials, people can learn from the data. And so during the conduct of the trial, the drug sponsors protect that data. It is their data. And after the trials are over, we are hopeful that these drug sponsors share this data in a de-identified confidential manner, so that people can research it and learn from it.
And kind of going off that, a question came by that asks about how the MyTomorrows program is protecting the information provided. How do they maintain confidentiality and privacy for when they provide that information to the site?
So, Melody, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. So MyTomorrows does not have your full medical. They're not going to have any of the clinical trial data or your medical records outside of the medical information known to either include or exclude. And they do follow, data privacy. There is a full consent where, they declare or kind of walk through their legalese on their website. So before that you would even upload anything, you would read the agreement. If it's something you're not comfortable with, then it's you can make that individual decision with that information. But because they're only looking at your medical data that helps determine if you are actually eligible for the trial. And the reason that they do this is not actually just to collect your data, it's to not waste your time. Because without these medical confirmations, what we don't want to happen is someone to go through the process, believe that they are interpreting something correctly based on the site, not have that kind of medical step where we're confirming through medical documentation. And then someone goes to a trial thinking they do qualify and they don't. Or inversely, someone being excluded too soon because some of the medical terms just get a little confusing and you said yes versus no. They will never, MyTomorrows does not get any of the clinical data. So there is no partnership where the sites are giving MyTomorrows data back. They don't get information on who actually enrolls. If you get that trial and you go and enroll without telling MyTomorrows, there's never a kickback that somebody lets them know it's you would tell them that you're in the trial, not a third party or the institution. So the only real data of yours that they have is that confirmation level medical data, and they do disclose all of their legalese, and you would have to consent. Honestly, it's a step before you could even do it. Before you could upload it, you would have to hit a box that says I consent to their data kind of regulations.
Perfect. And I'm just going to kind of combine a few questions in one, because a few questions that are coming over are about specific situations, whether it's the person's age who has ALS, or the specific gene they have, or their status being bedbound or ventilated, and asking if there is clinical trials out there for them where they're at in this journey. And so I just want to see if you're able to answer that, whether there's clinical trials available for people who are maybe at different stages of this disease.
I could take that one, Melody, if you want. Yes, regardless of how long you've had ALS, there are studies ongoing. They may either be clinical trials, which are interventional, where you're testing a drug, or they could be clinical studies where, you are following the natural history of the study. There is a natural history study ongoing right now, which accepts people with ALS at any stage of the disease, and this is the all ALS study, and I will be happy to put in a link for that. These natural history studies are really important because these allow us to study what's happening in your body at the molecular level, at the clinical level, at genetic level, when you are progressing through the disease. And that's why it's called natural history of the disease. And so these natural history studies are really important. And so, if you've had ALS for a few years and you can't participate in a drug trial because most drug trials try to get people in earlier stages of the disease, because that's, the idea is that there's enough biology there, early biology for the drug to work on. That doesn't mean that you can't participate in the clinical study process. There is as I said, studies that are, natural history studies, and other types of observational studies that you can be part of.
Great. And I just want to mention, because I see it in a question here, and I know you just mentioned the all ALS study. Actually, the presenter for Wednesday is going to be covering the all ALS study. So there's a lot of great information for our webinar on Wednesday at 3 p.m. And then I saw somebody had kind of given a shout out to the ALS CDC National Registry as a simple way to participate in research. And we're actually going to be having a presentation on that for our Thursday webinar at 3 p.m. as well. So a lot of these topics you guys are bringing up, we will be covering throughout our webinar series this week. So that's good because it tells me we're answering some of the questions you guys have. We have a time for a few more questions. I see a couple more coming across. If you do not qualify for a trial at a specific time, will MyTomorrow contact you at a later date if one opens up that you qualify for?
Depends on how much information you've given them and when the trial kind of overlap. So there is kind of that engagement with the navigator piece. I would say if it's trials that are coming up in a year or two, probably in your best benefit to kind of go back. But because it is an ongoing process, so kind of start to finish is a few months. If trials change during that time when you're actively participating, those navigators are aware of those and are kind of confirming against your record. Another piece, though, is MyTomorrows works directly with physicians, and they have an AI platform where physicians can upload de-identified but really comprehensive medical records, and it can do scans and kind of, it searches all trials pretty quickly. And those are more in partnership with your physician, and those based on when your physician is, to the individual that's mentioned having the advocate at KU aware of those, right? In that potential place, someone could be checking their patients against registries, finding new emerging. It is not so sophisticated that there's going to be an alert or an automated generated email, because it does rely on kind of human power to be looking as new trials come up. I will tell you, when we recently saw a new trial come up maybe 2 or 3 months ago, we had a lot, it was well publicized, and we had a lot of folks reaching out to us ahead of time saying, do you know when this is going to come up? I'm really interested in this trial. That kind of buzz is definitely felt at the MyTomorrows level. And as those trials are coming up, their goal is to get people into trial as fast as possible too. So know that is the goal, is to find folks that qualify for trial and to make sure that we can navigate those to it. But the question of will you get an email or a text or an automatic enrollment at this time, no, their technology doesn't unfortunately have that capability.
Okay. And then there's a few questions about getting enrolled in specific trials. One asks if there are trials that exclude those with spinal stenosis and scoliosis. One asks about a C9ORF72 trial. So if you're trying to find specific trials, maybe you're already aware of them. Is the MyTomorrows program beneficial for that search? Is that a program that'll help connect you with those specific trials that maybe you already have in mind and just need to find how to enroll?
Yeah, if you have a trial in mind, and there's a couple of ways to approach. One, you can talk with your physician to see if they're connected in with that trial site, depending on if it's in your, again, I'm going to keep going to KU. I live in St. Louis, so I'm very close to, and I used to live in Kansas City, so I'm deferring to my KU example, right? Your physician might know of those trials that are very, help you navigate if you've got something in mind, if it is part of that kind of clinic network or that hospital system. You can go right to your physician and kind of get a little bit closer to the source. If it is not someone a lot of these, but of the site, of the trial happening, you say, I can see that it's occurring on this campus. There are clinical kind of point people at those levels, but MyTomorrows does provide that one-on-one tailor to go through and say, let's make sure that you really qualify. And so when we get you, when you are approaching that site, it is kind of a confirmation versus starting over at the screening call. And know that a lot of times the sites will double check. Just because you come with the MyTomorrows kind of stamp of approval, that site still does have due diligence to go through and confirm. So it might feel like a little bit of double paperwork, but again, it is to truly make sure that the right folks are in the right trials. So there are a lot of ways to find resources on clinical trials. This is just another one. If you have a way that works better for you, or you've been plugged in with your sites that are offered, then I encourage you to keep doing what is working. But if you are looking for more resources or different resources, or nothing has worked, give MyTomorrows a try. If it works for you, I'm really hopeful. I recognize it might not work for you, as we are still looking for different ways for our community to benefit from resources to clinical trials.
Great.
And
Great.
Ryan, I can just answer the specific question about spinal stenosis and things like that. We don't have that kind of detailed information on every trial that's going on. That's what happens once you're matched with a trial. Then the trial sponsor and the trial coordinator will work with you to understand all the different, limitations that one may have, and whether they are restricted for that trial or not. So, for example, if a trial requires a spinal cord injection, then, maybe someone with stenosis may not, maybe that's an exclusion criteria. I'm not saying that would be the case. I'm just giving you an example. But if you have to take the drug through the mouth, then having spinal stenosis would not be an issue. So we don't have that kind of information here at the association, sort of deep down on every trial, on every inclusion or exclusion criteria. What I would say is, if you're interested in the trial, find these different approaches. MyTomorrow is one of them, to get to a trial. And then there is a process of recruitment that goes on, where the trial sponsor tries to understand whether you meet all the inclusion or exclusion criteria or not.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And I also saw a couple, and I know, Kodip, you answered one about the ALS Association working with the FDA. I see one here about kind of what the future of ALS is with the cure and developing a cure. And I do just want to point out that Kodip will be joining us on Friday to talk a little bit about the ALS Association's role in the future of these clinical trials, and will likely touch a little bit on some of those types of questions. So I want to try to stick with mostly just questions that are related to the MyTomorrows program today. One that maybe you guys could answer is, when somebody is enrolled in a clinical trial, and they come off of the, or let's say they're improving, getting better, and the clinical trial ends, do they come off of that drug?
Yeah, so I could answer that. So it depends. I think most drug sponsors these days, and we, the association, encourage them to continue to provide the medication or the drug treatment to the person living with ALS if they think they're getting better. Now, in some cases, that's not possible because if the drug is completely, if the drug is, fails in the trial, and this happened with one of the drugs a couple of years ago. The drug failed, and it was a antibody injection drug, and so the person had to go into the clinic to get an injection. Well, if the drug is no longer available, then if the trial sites are no longer running that trial, then how are you going to get that injection? So I think it just depends. I would say most of the time, the companies are providing either through expanded access or open label extension, compassionate use. They are providing drugs after the trial ends, but it's not a permanent thing. And you should work with your neurologist and your ALS specialist to sort of figure out the treatment of care, moving forward after you come off placebo or treatment.
Okay. And I just want to, because we're running short on time, I just want to bring up one more question. I know it's not necessarily related to MyTomorrows, but maybe you guys might be able to answer, just because I've seen it pop up twice. And it's basically just, are there trials without a placebo? Asking the reason for the placebo. If one of you are able to speak on that, great. But if not, I understand.
Yeah, I could touch on that. So yes, in an ideal world, there would not be a placebo, trial, and everybody would be on the drug. Unfortunately, it is not an ideal world because ALS is a really heterogeneous disease. And what we mean by that is if you have met one person with ALS, you have met that one person with ALS. Every ALS journey looks different. Someone may start with fasciculations in the hand. Someone may start with weakness in their legs. Someone may start with swallowing or speech deficits. Someone has fast progression. Someone may have slow progression. Somebody on this chat said they've had ALS for like 30 years, and some people may have it for 3 years, right? Everybody has a different flavor of ALS. And when you have a disease that's this heterogeneous, this diverse, you can't really do trials without a placebo. You need a placebo because you need to be able to compare it to something. We know that in neurology, this is also true of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. No placebo trials are just not possible. Most neurological diseases require placebo because these are heterogeneous diseases, and there's so much variability in the data, so much diversity in clinical, the way the disease presents clinically, that you need to have a placebo so that you can actually say that your drug had an effect. Otherwise, with the lack of hope, the hope would always be the drug works. And so you could potentially have a big placebo effect of the drug itself. And so it is very important to have placebo. Now, are study sponsors getting better with that? Yes. They are starting to come and reduce placebo levels 2 to 1 type design. We're also trying to reduce placebo through understanding of biomarkers so that the more homogeneous the trial population is, the fewer placebo participants you would need. So yes, the drug sponsors and the ALS Association and the FDA all are working to reduce that heterogeneity, so that we can have fewer and fewer placebo. But I don't think we'll ever be able to get rid of placebo completely.
Hey, well, Thank you so much for the great questions and the great answers. Unfortunately, we are out of time. If we did not answer your question, I put my email address in the chat. Please feel free to send me a message, and I can try to work to get you an answer. But thank you to our wonderful speakers, Melody and Brittany, for the wealth of information on the My Tomorrows program. Thanks to Coldip for hopping on and being a resource for us and being able to answer some of those questions that they had. We hope those in attendance found the information helpful. Once again, just to mention, ColdDip will be presenting at the end of the week to kind of wrap up clinical trial week. But we will be hosting another webinar tomorrow at 3 p.m. And that webinar will be presented by Dr. Nicholas Maragakis, and the title of that webinar is Turning Science into ALS Clinical Trials. So you can join us using the same link that you used to join the webinar today. A final reminder that a survey should pop up on your browser when we end the webinar. Please don't forget to complete that survey if you are able to. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, and we hope to see you tomorrow for our 3 p.m. webinar.